feature. So again, thank you everyone for being here. Welcome, and thank you especially to our special guest, Marsha Lederman, and our guest moderator, Professor David DeWitt. And with that, over to you.
Jay, thanks very, very much. Marsha, it's really a pleasure. After years of reading your Globe and Mail columns, it really is nice to have this NIFC organized conversation with you. And I was thrilled to have the opportunity to read your book and then go through it again. And I very much enjoyed and appreciated all that you wrote.
Thank you.
So,
And thanks. I just want to say thanks for the invitation, and thanks for everyone who's spending time with us this evening. It's afternoon where I am in Vancouver, but I basically live on Eastern time, so I'm good with evening. And it is an auspicious day, and I have a lot more hope than I did when this interview was booked. So I'll,
all
I'll
right.
hand it over to you.
Thank you.
Also, I just want to say that if we read David's bio, it's much more impressive than mine. So,
Your recently published book, for those who haven't had a chance to look at it, is entitled October 7th, Searching for the Humanitarian Middle. And it reads to me as almost like a publicly shared diary in which you observe and report and assess and comment and reflect, deeply reflect, often critically, and at times despairingly. So I'm curious and I'm pleased to hear your comment just now that you're almost moving towards something more hopeful. So as I read it, it's as if it's in real time and we're looking over your shoulder. You draw upon history to put those real-time events and public statements into a wider context that challenges our dual aspirations of never again and living in a liberal democracy, whether Canada or Israel. Your recitation of Jewish family history and intergenerational trauma includes an abiding sense of fear, anxiety, and ultimately a lack of surprise. I think a lack of surprise, albeit with disappointment, in the way our diaspora environment has erupted into polarization, extremism, and anti Semitism. While the context of your book is October 7th and its aftermath, much of your focus is on Canadian society and being Jewish in Canada. It seems to me that you are an objective journalist in bringing information forward, but at the same time, you're unabashedly subjective in bringing your own history and values to the assessment. It seems to me that has afforded you insights that others miss, while providing you with a credible base from which to provide critical and challenging commentary. So let me get to my first question or two. October sets the context for this book, while the subtitle of your book is the phrase, Searching for the Humanitarian Middle. Does this refer to an investigation of Canada as a liberal democracy and a plea for respectful discourse? Or is it an argument for a strategic goal, peace based on two states? What motivated you and your editors to do this after the outbreak of the war, when we saw little evidence of a cessation of violence or a return of hostages? And while activism and demonstrations in Canada and elsewhere became ever more disruptive and challenging.
okay. Thank you for that. Really, actually beautiful assessment of what I've written. I appreciate it. I just want to make sure, can everyone hear me okay? Because there was some concern about a microphone. Let me know if you can't, I'll figure it out.
Yeah,
Um,
if you could make it a little louder.
ma- uh,
Yeah, I don't know how you do that, but
I don't think I can make it louder. Someone has to do it, but I'll
um,
speak louder if that helps.
And
Uh,
those who
great.
are hearing you can raise the volume of their computers.
yeah, raise your volume if possible. But I will project as much as I can. So there's a lot there. I will say that the idea for putting these columns together came rather spontaneously when I was meeting with my book editor in Toronto. She had edited my first book, which was about the Holocaust and intergenerational trauma. She's not Jewish. She told me that she'd been at I think it was a baby shower, and someone had come up to her. I think it was the mother of the woman who was having the baby, and said that the woman said to her, I know, I heard you're Marsha's editor. I just want you to know that I've been reading every word she's written since October 7th, and it's really helped me. And Haley, my editor, told me this, and which meant a lot to me, hearing that. And then Haley said, I wonder if we should do a compilation. And this was June of 2024. And very quickly, we got to work. She got the green light. I got the green light from the Globe. And by the end of August, we had collected everything. And I had done the contextual writing. Each
Mm.
column, it's a very much, yes, an over the shoulder experience because we wanted to um, offer a contemporaneous look at what was going on in that year. And so I didn't want to change anything. There are figures that change as new information comes, and even you can see some of, I think, my own thinking evolving over that year, but we didn't want to change anything. We wanted it to be almost a record of what that year was like. Certainly from my perspective, or from the perspective of a Canadian Jewish person who was feeling a lot of angst at that time, and continues to feel a lot of angst, I should say. So, along the way, I was trying to explain where I stood in all of this. At one point, I said to someone, I feel ideologically homeless because
Mhm.
I'm a proud member of the Jewish community. My parents were Holocaust survivors. That is essential to my being. But on the other hand, I am a proud, and this is not necessarily a but, I am also a, a proud member of, not member, but I consider myself progressively um, in favor of social justice. I'm a progressive. And suddenly it felt like these two things were at odds, certainly in terms of what people from these two communities were saying. And no community is a monolith, especially the Jewish community. Arguing is in our DNA. And I think that's good. Debating is in our DNA. And I was trying to figure out my place in all of this and how I was feeling because I was obviously horrified by the October 7th attacks. I mean, it was extremely upsetting, obviously, to anyone, should have been. And then I was extremely upset about what was happening in Gaza more and more and more as time went on. And I felt like a military response um, was, well, not I felt like, I saw that there were a huge number of casualties. And of course, it's only grown and grown. So I was trying to explain that. I care about the hostages. I mourn those who were killed. I'm grieving the hostages. I'm also mourning and grieving those who were killed in Gaza. One does not negate the other. I am pro-Palestinian and I believe in the state of Israel, which makes me a Zionist, which has become a terrible slur in some circles, that I once considered myself really part of. But I believe in a state of Israel. I also disagree strongly with many of the actions of this current government, and not just this current government, but I'm against the occupation and I'm very much for a two-state solution. So just trying to navigate all of that, it felt like I was sort of in the middle. And but I wasn't in the middle of it because I'm on the periphery. So because I'm here safely in Canada. And so the middle, I needed to find a way to explain what that middle was like. And for me, I just cared about the humans, care about the humans. And so that's how I came up with that term, humanitarian middle. And a lot of people have taken issue with it. The term humanitarian, given everything we've seen, I understand. It almost seems like a ludicrous term at times. Um, and also middle, like how do you have a middle ground? Like how can you not be staunchly against war or staunchly for the rights of Palestinians? I am for both of those. I am a peacenik. I'm against war. I'm for the rights of Palestinians. And so I'm not entrenched on one side or the other. And I feel like there's been a lot of entrenchment, very polarized, um, I'll say debate, but it's not. It's almost like throwing, like flame throwing. And I wanted the other point of the book for me uh, was to uh, create an opportunity for discussion, to allow people to have conversations, and not just people who strongly agree with each other. Sometimes it's uncomfortable and awkward and really hard. But I think it's a lot better than just, shouting slogans at each other on social media. So that is a very long way of possibly answering your question. I'm not even sure, but that's where the title came from and why we wanted to do the book.
So let me pursue this a little bit. Um, while anti-Semitism and memory are constants in your work, and understandably so, and appropriately so, and powerfully so, you also mention the growing presence of other extremist and racist beliefs and behaviors already prevalent well before October 7th. Both Irwin Cotler and Deborah Lyons had government mandates to educate and to inform with the goal to change beliefs and behaviors. Uh, it was a recognition in Ottawa that there was a trend that was worrying for a liberal democracy, and it needed to be addressed and officially addressed and well addressed. And a parallel role focused on Islamophobia. Given your many years of observing and commenting on these matters, how have the past 2 years affected your thoughts about achieving that humanitarian middle? I ask this noting that not only in Canada, but across many Western democratic countries, since October 7th, there has been a significant downturn in public support for Israel, with a significant increase in support for Palestinians and a Palestinian state. And I add even a worrying expression of antipathy towards the notion of a Jewish state.
Mm, yeah, I agree with all of that. Um, One thing that I forgot to mention in um, my search for the term humanitarian middle, part of being in the middle was being absolutely shocked. Maybe I shouldn't have been shocked, but I was shocked by the rise of anti-Semitism
Mm.
post October 7th. And my belief that you can be upset about anti Semitism in Canada, and that does not negate being upset about the war in Gaza.
Mm.
I express my opinions for a living, and I often wrote about anti Semitism. And I'll tell you, I have received a lot of feedback, um, much of it really not appropriate for a family gathering like this one. But how dare I care about anti Semitism in Canada when children are dying in Gaza? And yes, I am not saying these are equal concerns, but as someone who lives in Canada, I have every right to live in a society free of discrimination against me as based on my ethnicity, just like everyone else does. And I mean, that was part of, I guess, the humanitarian thing, blaming the Jewish community here or at large for what the Netanyahu government was doing was really upsetting. And I shouldn't say was. I don't know why I'm speaking in past tense because it continues. So, yes, the rise of anti Semitism has been really horrifying. And I'll tell you, I miss my parents so much. I especially miss them around this time of year, the high holidays. And this year, well, actually, for about 2 years, I've been thinking, thank God they're not alive to see this, because it's bad for me as a child of survivors, but for the survivors who are still with us, it has been absolutely it's so triggering isn't a strong enough word. This has just been abhorrent. So yeah, there's no question that anti-Semitism is on the rise, unfortunately. Or maybe it's just that the expression of anti-Semitism is somehow more I don't know, or less uncouth, let's say. It used to be very rude to be anti Semitic, and suddenly um, we're seeing a lot of it. Still rude. That said, I want to make it clear it is perfectly appropriate to criticize the state of Israel. That doesn't that doesn't make you anti-Semitic. Sometimes one bleeds into the other. There's no question, and we've seen a lot of that. I try to spend less time on social media than I used to, but I still have to. I have to for my job, and it's probably a skewed view of what's happening out there, but it is really nasty, and I've seen some really horrible things, and I'm going to say I'm better now, but in the first few months after October 7th, I was being fueled by terror. I was really scared. And you can say that's crazy, you're safe, and I am. I'm physically safe. But it has been a really scary time. And for someone like me who grew up in a time like really a golden age for Jews, I would say, where anti-Semitism was very much frowned upon, to see it like just explode so quickly and easily, um, that has been shattering, actually.
As an aside, I'd say that um, while my parents weren't Holocaust survivors, they were refugees from Europe. And so I can understand. And I must say, professionally, when I think about the decades in which I both taught and did research on international politics, one would never have anticipated um, the crashing of the liberal and internet post-war international system. One would never have anticipated the return of the extremist politics of the right and the left, which also includes among them anti-Semitism. So it's more than just disturbing. Let
Yeah,
me,
it's really shocking. Must be an interesting time to be a political scientist, I imagine.
well, fortunately, when I'm introduced these days, I say I'm a lapsed political scientist. Tired. So let me move on just a little bit. In your column, only 3 days after October 7th, which is in your book, you wrote, and I quote, and I shorten the piece. The dislocation and oppression of Palestinian people is despised by many liberal Jews like me, in Israel and in the diaspora. But to behold triumphant pro-Palestinian rallies now, this feels more than a betrayal. It feels scary, which is what you just referred to. So we read about the conflation of Jew, Israeli, settler colonialist, just as people conflate Arab, Palestinian, Hamas, terrorists. There is a blurring of distinctions so that distrust, insecurity, even hate and revenge color conversation and impede opportunities for dialogue, which is a bedrock of liberal democracies. There was the World War II generation, the Vietnam War generation, the Six-Day War generation, the 9/11 generation. They all came with the ideological declaration, true or not, but aspirational, of liberation and the promotion and protection of democracy. And then we should not forget the 1947-48 generation, state for Jews and the Nakba for Palestinians. Now we will have the Gaza War generation, not just among Israelis and Palestinians, but among the many who have viewed the war through digital media. This will affect attitudes and policies of peoples and governments in years to come. And it will mobilize political action. And we've already seen that. Strikingly, on the subtitle of part one of your book, you wrote, and I quote, "I don't know how we come back from this or where we go." And if there is a Gaza generation, that's a very important set of questions to ask. Do you now have any sense about how, even whether we can come back and what that might mean? Do the meetings this week in Jerusalem and Sharm el-Sheikh provide you a sense of the possible? What do you anticipate will occur within Canada, given the declaratory position of the federal government and recognition or conditional recognition of a Palestinian state? I know that's a big set of questions, but
Yeah. Well, I still don't know how we're going to get out of this, but I do have some hope, as I said off the top, which I didn't have a week ago. I do feel that we're heading toward, I hope, a two-state solution, which many people are opposed to on both sides. Um, I I believe that while this deal was imposed, and I know some people are unhappy about that, in particular, some
Mhm.
people who are concerned about Palestinians. I think whatever had to be done to um, to stop the bombing and the military aggression and to get the hostages home. Whatever had to be done was done. And I am so thankful for that. And I have found myself praising people, one in particular that I never thought I would praise ever in my life. But sometimes it pays off to be a bully, I'll say. But what must happen next must absolutely include the people who are most affected by this. So this can't be just imposed on the Palestinian people. The Palestinian people need to be involved in this, along with the wider Arab um, community, geopolitical community. And I actually think that's where we're going. Maybe I'm being Pollyanna-ish, but I feel like that's in the works. I'm not saying it's going to be easy. There are
Mhm.
huge stumbling blocks along the way. Um, so there's that. But how long is that going to take? I realized, I said this recently, I realized that I don't think in my lifetime Israel will recover from this in terms of its international standing, its international reputation. It has become uh, a pariah for so many and very diplomatically isolated. I also don't know how long it's going to take to rebuild Gaza, and not just the buildings, but
Of course.
lives have been altered forever. Family members are gone. Family members are maimed. Um, how do you return to some semblance of a normal life, and how quickly can that happen? So I think we're looking at a very, very long term um, process of healing. I'll use the term healing, but that's not exactly right. Rebuilding. Um, I don't know. I don't know what is going to happen politically in Israel. I think that will be very interesting. There are supposed to be elections next year. I
Mhm.
don't know what happens to Netanyahu's coalition now with the very right wing people he has gotten into bed with politically. So there are obviously a lot of unknowns, but I feel like we this war has been so lengthy, brutal, and so it has really been pervasive in terms of um, affecting the discourse far beyond people who are normally interested in Middle East politics. It
And
really
that's
has
why,
affected
yes,
everything, as you were saying, right?
the Gaza generation is a,
Exactly.
is a generation of those who've been following on social media, on digital media, and they span the world.
And they have very strong opinions against Israel for the most part. I mean, I haven't done a worldwide survey, I should say, but talking to young people, this is the feeling I get. Also, algorithms are dishing things up. I'm
Mhm.
getting a lot of stuff that's um, pro Israel, I'll say, and other people are getting something else in their feeds. And this is really affecting people, and people are being educated in many ways by the zeitgeist and by social media.
Mhm.
And yes, you're absolutely right to call it the Gaza War generation. And just one more point, I'm very interested in intergenerational trauma. It's something I believe I suffer from. I One of the things that has been so hard to take is the knowledge that not we, but these events have not just traumatized the people who are there now, but these peoples, Gazans, Israelis, people, Palestinians in the West Bank too, onlookers and family members. There is going to be intergenerational trauma for generations. And we've created another crisis that um, be will not be fixed and patched up by any political solution. The damage is far too deep, and it will continue on.
So
Sorry
let
about
me,
that very dark and gloomy answer.
let me, through this next question, move, continue this aspect of the conversation. And I want to do it by drawing from Raja Khoury, who you may
Mm.
know.
Yeah, I just
And,
finally met him
okay,
in Toronto at the Haaretz
and the
conference,
Haaretz
and
conference, yes.
and he we've been emailing back and
Good.
forth, and of course I
Okay.
read his book too. Yeah.
So, for those who don't know, Raja Khoury is an Arab Canadian of Palestinian heritage and a leader in Arab Jewish dialogue in Canada. And in an opinion piece published in the Globe and Mail just last week, he wrote, and I'm just quoting a small part of it: "It can be hard for a non Jew to understand the Jewish attachment to Israel. For a Palestinian, it is near impossible. Seeing the Israeli flag hanging in every synagogue I visited always baffled me. I wondered, why is this community raising a flag of a country most did not originally come from? They may be, it may be their diaspora in terms of their Jewish identity, but not in terms of Israel. Why do so many Jewish organizations defend Israel, regardless of whether it's right or wrong?" And just as an aside, I should note that in our Shemini Atzeret and Yizkor services earlier this week, It concluded with the singing of Hatikva, and yes, there was an Israeli flag on the bima. So it's true that many, if not most, Jews and Jewish organizations in Canada traditionally have aligned themselves with Israel. And as you've written, Marsha, a norm has existed that avoids public criticism of Israeli policies and actions. That's really been a standard for many decades. However, increasingly there are strong supporters of the Israeli people who declare themselves as Zionists and yet who are increasingly prepared to be publicly critical of the Israeli government and its policies. Many see no contradiction, as you earlier stated, in support for Israel while also being in support of the establishment of a Palestinian state. They may no longer agree that CIJA represents them in Ottawa. I suspect that the emerging Gaza generation may strengthen that criticism. Raja, like so many others, has long promoted the two-state solution as the only way to move forward in peace and security for both Palestinians and Israelis. Recognize that there are extremists on both sides who don't want that.
Yes.
So, how would you respond to Raj's comments and the conventional self restraint of the Canadian Jewish leadership? Will the past be the best predictor of the future as the Gaza generation emerges?
No, I think things are changing. And I found that piece that you just quoted from so heartfelt, hard to read parts of it,
Mhm.
but so well expressed, and it really affected me. Um, Raja and I were supposed to meet actually about a year ago when he was in town for the Vancouver Writers Festival. He reached out to me. He wanted to sit down and talk because he'd found, I guess, an opening in some of the columns that I'd written that
Mhm.
might allow for some real dialogue. Unfortunately, I had to cancel because I got COVID, but that's a whole other story. Um, the There is, I mean, Israel is very, it's very important to the Jewish people. I mean, I really noticed you were talking about being at synagogue or at shul. When I went for Kol Nidre and then returned the next day for Yiskor and Nila, I was noticing in the prayer book how often there were references to Zion,
Mhm.
Zion, to Israel, Eretz Israel, and I thought, yes, it's not just about this political state. This is in the books. This is part of what we chant, what we have chanted for generations, hundreds, thousands of years. So, of course, it looms large in our identity, but more eh, on a more modern concern is what happened to our parents' generations. And for us, Israel was the beautiful thing that arose out of the Holocaust, which was the worst thing. So, my parents, who lost all of their families for the most part, my mother's sister survived, thank goodness. Um, they had this gift, if I can say, of the state of Israel that would always be there to protect Jews so that what happened to them and their families would never happen again. They had a voice on the international stage, and it was like this dreamy, beautiful thing that came out of the absolute horrors of the Holocaust. Um, And we grew up, I'll talk about me. I grew up learning about this and learning the history of Israel and caring very deeply about Israel. And I still care very deeply about Israel. But I didn't learn the whole story. No one talked about the Nakba. I'd never heard that term growing up. Yet I could name all the wars: the War of Independence, the Sinai, Six-Day War, Yom Kippur War, etc. Um, and but we were told the story, and I think this is in one of the columns, or it's in the book somewhere. We are told the story as if it had a happy ending,
Yeah.
and um, it didn't for Palestinians who were displaced, who lost their homes, who lost their olive fields, their their livelihoods, the history of their families in the soil. Um, it was a terrible event, and I didn't know about that. So I think, like I said, I still love Israel and I care about Israel very, very much. I also care very, very much for Palestinians, for all people, and all people deserve to live life safely, securely, with dignity. This is, and again, this I'm really being very. This is a very soft response. I would like to see a two-state solution, so both peoples will have their own state. Um, but I do think that even if for the crowd that is more fundamentalist and right wing in its support of Israel, that doesn't care as much for the Palestinians, and I understand that. Or I mean, I don't understand that personally, but I understand that that exists. Just for the sake of Israel, you should want there to be a two-state solution. You should want security and good lives for the Palestinians, even if it's only for the sake of Israel, because this is an existential threat moment for Israel, in my opinion. And the Palestinians deserve a good life. They deserve life just the way I do and you do. Um, but if that doesn't appeal to you for whatever reason, and you only care about the state of Israel, this is important for the security and safety of people in Israel as well.
Okay. I want to shift for a moment to Israel specifically, because one of the dramatic, even exciting and hopeful things that occurred beginning the year before October 7th was the outpouring of support for Israeli democracy in addressing the challenges to the legal system and to what some felt was an effort to undermine the, the responsibilities, the power, the capacity of the senior courts of the Israeli legal system. And
Yes.
then that morphed into the demonstrations after October 7th. All kinds of undercurrents there in terms of hostages, in terms of calling into question where the government was on October 7th, where was the IDF, where's the support, and so forth and so on. So for many, and you refer to aspects of this in your book, demonstrations are an important symbol, important activity of a liberal democracy. They give space, they give opportunity, and elected governments are there to listen, to try and understand, and to extract from those demonstrations. For some observers, those demonstrations in Israel were a codification of Israel continuing to be a liberal democracy in the midst of terrible threat. But for others, what emerged was what was perceived as a very harsh response by the Netanyahu government, to the extent to which uh, the protests were not being listened, the protesters weren't being listened to. The police were increasingly rough in terms of how they handled demonstrators. And the Netanyahu government seemed to ignore what the concerns and the expectations were. And Anna Applebaum, as you know, has written for the last few years about how liberal democracies can unexpectedly, quickly, rapidly slip into becoming illiberal democracies. And there are now those who are arguing Israel has moved away from being a liberal democracy into being an illiberal one, verging on the edge of being authoritarian. Now, that may be an overstatement. I'm not arguing for that, but that's certainly part of the discourse, especially when you consider the actions of politicians such as Ben Gvir and Smotrich, and their actions having to do with Gaza, but also in the West Bank, having to do with Israeli Palestinian citizens, as well as those on the left.
And their attitudes,
So,
not just their
yes,
actions. Their Yeah,
we're
not
you
a
and I,
fan.
we're both of generations that saw Israel as an incomplete but aspiring liberal democracy. And you refer to that. We all grew up with this aspiration that liberal democracy and the Israeli state went hand in hand, and therefore we in the diaspora were thrilled to have it and to support it. Is it sufficiently resilient to recover from the pressures of this war? If illiberal democracy in Israel becomes entrenched, and that's a big if, I grant you, do you see Canadians, especially of the Gaza uh, generation, and Canadians of the Jewish community any longer supportive of Israel? If it's no longer seen as a bastion of liberal democracy for all its citizens?
Mm, that is a big question. I think that there will be a lot of people who will feel they need to speak up in order to ensure that it continues to be or returns to that um, governance of as a liberal democracy. I think for many people, their love of Israel is unconditional. And yes, I think those are not the people of the Gaza generation. I think we're going to see a huge shift as um, the Gen Z generation comes up in terms of their feelings about Israel. I am still hopeful. I'm still hopeful for that country. I'm a journalist, so I'm bad at math. But even I could see very early on what was happening in terms of people, the Haredi and, the very ultra Orthodox families having many children, and those children were going to grow up to vote. And then the secular families were having one or two children, and there are going to be a lot fewer votes on that side. That might be very simplistic, but it's it's something that is, and I know it's affecting the military as well. I I'm going to choose to have hope, but I do recognize and acknowledge that there are big challenges ahead in terms of international support for Israel in the diaspora. I'm planning a trip right now to Israel because for something I'm working on, something I'm writing, and I told someone and a Jewish person, and they said I wouldn't go there now, and they weren't meaning because they didn't feel safe. They didn't feel they wanted to go and support the current government, which I understand. Um,
So I
yes.
have one quick question before we turn to some quick questions that viewers have sent in. And I'm going to shorten it tremendously and basically go right to the question without the context. What is our way back to a sense of safety and security? Because safety and security is something that runs through your entire book. The first year, and that's what this book is about, the first year of October 7th of the Gaza War, time and time again, you express concerns as an individual, as a member of the Jewish community, perhaps as a member of progressive liberal democratic community, of about safety and security, maybe individual and maybe the safety and security of the country, of the culture, of the political culture. So how do we and our fellow Canadians secure that humanitarian middle that you begin with in a liberal democratic Canada?
Well, we need to be doing stuff like this, talking to each other, listening. Again, Pollyannish, that's not really going to accomplish anything, but I I've gone out of my way to reach out to some of my friends who are not Jewish to try to explain to them what it has felt like, um, and how isolated I have been feeling. And that has gone a long way. They check in with me. A whole bunch of my non-Jewish friends checked in with me on October 7th just to see how I was doing. And that felt really important. And these are very minor little things. I I hope that people will speak out about bad behavior, about any kind of discrimination, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, any any racism. Um, I think it really behooves us. And maybe I'm just thinking off the top of my head here. Maybe now that people like me have experienced it in a much more direct,
Mm.
um, kind of um, scary manner, maybe some people might be um, more willing to step up when they see it happening to someone else. I don't know. Again, I'm just speaking off the top of my head. I really do believe that most people are good. Most people are not racist. Most people are not anti-Semitic. Most people don't wish for the deaths of Israelis or Palestinians. But the people who have difficult opinions, I'll say, are often the loudest. So those of us in the middle need to do what we can. Speak up, speak to each other, um, do a mitzvah and reach out to someone who's suffering. Um, and I don't know, maybe that'll help the world become a slightly better place. I think that was a very unsatisfactory answer, David. I'm sorry.
Oh, it's all right. Let me uh, ask a question that comes from one of the viewers, Sam Briggs. Um, whoops. That's sorry, from Larry Till. Uh,
Mhm.
what role do you, as a journalist, see the traditional media playing in the growth of extremism? Is this the modern expression of if it bleeds, it leads, or is it something else?
Yeah, what came first, the chicken or the egg? There is so much interest in this particular conflict and so much of activity out on the streets in terms of protests and posters and graffiti. If we don't report on it, does it stop? Or if or how do we say it's not worth reporting on because it's out there? So maybe one is fueling the other, but I really believe in this case that the mainstream media um, has not done the damage that social media has done. Social media is just so toxic, so full of outright lies and misinformation, disinformation, hatred. uh, Mainstream media at least is, it doesn't do that. I know a lot of people feel that the mainstream media has been unfairly hard on Israel. I understand that, but I'll tell you that there are a lot of people who are in the again, I use these terms very loosely, but on the pro-Palestinian side, who feel that the media is too pro-Israel and too anti-Palestinian. So everyone's viewing things through a certain lens, but we really work hard as journalists to try to reflect what is going on fairly. um, Social media is another matter, and 20-year-olds are not getting their information from mainstream media. They're getting it from TikTok, and that's very concerning.
There's a question from Jay. He would like you to address what non-Jews don't understand about the Jewish peoplehood. How should we explain it?
Boy. um, I
And that's
I
in
mean,
some
we're not,
ways a
again,
spin-off
we're
from
not,
Raja.
yeah, and we're not a monolith, right? We're all different. you're probably not as crazy as I am, but I think I've been thinking a lot about tribalism and with all of this that's gone on, and how sometimes it just feels safe to gravitate towards people who are like us. And I understand, like, I think of my parents, I don't think they had any friends who were not Jewish. All of their friends
Mm.
were Jewish. And maybe that was a different time. And that's certainly not my experience. But there is this, um, temptation, especially when you feel under attack, when you feel threatened, to go be with people who are like you, who understand without you having to explain it. Shortly after October 7th, I had, I just threw like a Shabbat potluck, which I'd never done before.
Right, it was in your
And
book.
yeah, yeah. And I invited, you know, all my Jewish friends here, which aren't that many. I'm not really a huge part of, hugely ensconced in the Jewish community here, but turns out I have quite a few Jewish friends too. And I invited them all, and I just felt like I needed to be around them. In fact, it was, now I remember really well, it was that same week. It was October 7th happened on that Thanksgiving weekend. And then on the Friday after was this day of rage. And in Vancouver, where I live, the day of rage epicenter where the protest was going to happen was very close to where I live. And I was very shaken by it, and talking to my son's dad, like, do we send him to school? Do we keep him home? And I said, no, we're sending him to school. I'm not letting that win. I may have used other saltier language. And that night, I just, like, I called together my Vancouver Jews, and we got together, and it felt not just safe, but I knew I was in a room full of people who understood without me explaining what was happening. Um, like, not just in the world, but to us, like to me personally and to them. And that was really appropriate for that night, and it was really helpful. Um, but I never want to cut myself off from people who have a different experience. And um, I have actually been in conversation with someone who is has a Palestinian family. She's Muslim, and she's also a writer. And she and I have been emailing back and forth, and that has been really helpful to me as well. These relationships are very important. Um, but so are my relations with my fellow Vancouver Jews. It's been really beautiful, actually.
So let me ask one last question because I know we're close to the end of our time. Um, I expect continued demonstrations in Canada. Some will be pro-Israel and some will be pro-Palestinian. Do you see any evidence that the level of anti-Semitism will subside as the diplomatic process evolves? Or do you think it's captive of the unresolved Israel-Palestine conflict and the conflation of Jewish with Israeli and Palestinian with terrorist?
Oh, I sure hope not. I do think, I will actually say, if there was a time when when people were making that connection, Palestinian and terrorist, and that's another thing that makes me crazy when people see a pro-Palestinian protest and say, "Oh, they're pro-terrorist." Come on, or they're pro-Hamas. That's just, it's so unfair. Um, and wrong. I do think that, well, we know anti-Semitism has been around long, 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 long before 1948, long before the State of Israel existed, and long before October 7th. This is another spike. We've had many, many, many spikes in our history. We have a whole bunch of holidays about these spikes. Um, I hope that things neutralize sooner rather than later. I don't know that it's going to feel the way it used to feel for me, that I would think, oh, it's ridiculous, anti-Semitism. It's not going to affect my life in any meaningful way, even though I always understood that it existed. I didn't think it was going to, like I said, affect my life in a meaningful way. For the last 2 years, it has affected my life in a very meaningful, difficult way. Again, I'm not saying that's as important as the people who are on the front lines and suffering in the Middle East. But here in Canada, it should not be acceptable. And I hope that this is something that more and more people take a stand against. It's not okay.
And with that, let me first of all thank you for this really marvelous conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I learned both from reading your columns in your book and from tonight. And so I thank you for that. And
Oh,
let
I
me turn it
thank
back to
you.
Jay.
Thank you for the best questions ever. You should just put all those questions together and publish them as a little book. Thank you. And thanks to everyone who's been listening and watching. And, I really appreciate it. Maybe this is not the happiest way to spend a Thursday evening, but it means a lot to have people really sit and engage with this. So thank you.
Well, I want to thank our guest, Marsha Lederman, for joining us tonight, and David DeWitt for excellent service as our moderator. It was an amazing conversation, and you've given us a lot to think about, a very complex topic, so kudos to you both. Thank you again to our CFPN administrator, Lisa Black, for running the show tonight. And if you haven't purchased Marsha's book, please do so at your favorite bookseller. It's a thoughtful and engaging work that belongs on everyone's reading list. If you enjoyed tonight's event, please consider supporting us with a donation by going to peacenowcanada.org/donations. The end of the war and the return of the hostages could be a watershed moment for peace and a two-state solution. Please help us bend the arc towards peace by donating to Canadian Friends of Peace Now. Also, please mark your calendar for our next free webinar event, which will be held on Sunday, November 16th, and emails will go out about that. Again, thank you to our guests, and thank you all the people who registered, all the people who came, for joining us this evening. And I bid you a wonderful night, evening, wherever you are. And again, all the best.
Good
Thanks.
night. Shalom.
Good night, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Shalom. Thank you, Marsha. Thank you, David. Be well, everyone.